the Renaissance. The objectives are: 1. Explain why between 1350 and 1550 Italian intellectuals believed they entered a new age of human achievement. And 2. Characterize city-states, which were centers of political, economic, and social life in Renaissance Italy. Now, first, let's talk about the idea of Renaissance, and then specifically the Italian Renaissance. The word Renaissance literally means rebirth. And really at the heart of the Renaissance is the idea of the rebirth of the ancient Greek and Roman world. It cropped up within this time, particularly during the Black Death, where people wanted to break away or disconnect themselves from the world that they currently existed in and what they were emerging into. With all of the warfare and religious conflict, particularly out of the papacy, and the Black Death and disease, we see a shift in attention back to the Greco-Roman world. Now, of course, people will point primarily to the arts, to sculpture, to painting, which are expressions of this shift back to the ancient way of thinking. But really at the heart of it is a change in the cognitive kind of context in which people are thinking. And it really began in Italy and spread to the rest of Europe. And so the Renaissance, in a true sense, is characterized and focused on Italy, because this was largely an urban phenomenon and is occurring in urban centers in Italy, particularly those that are dominated with trade and material affluence and disposable income. And so we're really going to focus on that sort of Italian Renaissance early on. Now, within this growing urban society, a secular or worldly focus began to bud. A worldly viewpoint began to emerge, where people began to focus on material things that came to dominate the consciousness of most people. Now, this isn't the negation of the spiritual, by no means. This is that people begin to see the world through a human gaze, a human perspective, rather than the divine, rather than the godlike. And this is not a negation, again, of deity or of Christianity, but rather the focus on the human perspective, the human gaze, the experience of humans. And this translates into art, trying to capture the true physical essence of the human condition and the human world and the human eye. We also see a return then to the ancient way of thinking about things, a return to ancient Greco-Roman mathematics and architecture and art and intellect. So it touches everything. And this was really during the age of recovery from the disasters of the 1300s, that 14th century kind of shift. And you see a new view of humanity emerging, a new view toward the human condition and human expression. Now, you end up seeing a high regard for human worth and a realization of what individuals could achieve through their kind of new social ideal toward the human condition and the world. And this is really characterized by the thinking and the approach of Leonardo da Vinci. Now, Da Vinci is well known for many things, but he is a true Renaissance man. He was a painter, a sculptor, an architect, an inventor, a mathematician, among many other things. And Leonardo da Vinci was characterized by an uncanny curiosity for the world around him. He drew infamous sketches of flying machines and the human body and what it might look without skin, looking at the muscular system. Or here in this depiction, what the womb might look like, or what the baby looks like inside the womb. So a very earthly, a very terrestrial, a very down-to-earth human interest, which is not the negation of the divine, but rather a curious gaze at the human condition and the human existence, which is completely different than what we see in the medieval period. And we begin to see churches and wealthy homes and public buildings being decorated with art that celebrated both religious and secular themes, things that correlated to the human body, to classical antiquity, and to the restoration of traditional Greco-Roman forms of expression. Now, for example, you might see a human figure or an angelic figure drawn in true human fashion and proportion. For example, this Renaissance sculpture of an angel, very human-like, very realistic, but angelic and divine. And how is it human? Well, look at the proportions. Look at the attempt to capture real hands, real hair, in terms of the human experience. So this is really the shift that we begin to see in Italy in the Renaissance. We also see in various Italian states the attempt to form powerhouse economic boom and artistic flourishing. So during the Middle Ages, Italy had really failed to develop a centralized monarchical state like England, like France, like Spain. Italy was not unified in Italy. It really centered and focused around city-states and the sprawl of territory around city-states. And so these are really fractured and split apart in the north and in central Italy and some in the south, sporadic and interdispersed with the papal states. The three major city-states that deserve our attention here are Milan, Venice, and Florence. Now, these three specifically deserve our attention. Now, focusing on Milan first. Milan, located in northern Italy, at the crossroads of a major main trade route going from the Italian coastal cities to the Alpine Pass, was one of the richest city-states in Italy. Why? Because it was a focal point where those who wanted to carry trade out of Italy, which, of course, was coming from the east through the Mediterranean, had to pass through Milan to get to France, to get to Europe proper. Now, the major family that dominated Milan was the Sforza family, and particularly Francesco Sforza became one of its important leaders, particularly focusing on trade. Now, how did he come to dominate and control his region? Was through mercenaries, through coin and wealth and purchasing military strength. So mercenaries were excessively used and quite extensively used in Milan, which really gave them a strong political and powerful hold in the north. We also see a similar trend within Venice. Venice was another major northern city-state, and this was a republic of Venice. And officially, Venice was a republic with an elected leader called a Doge. And we see a particular cultural, economic, and artistic trends really cropping up and blossoming here. And Venice's trade empire was tremendously profitable and made Venice an international power because of its focus on trade and its economic boom. And so Venice was certainly a focus point in the Renaissance Italian states. But we would be completely remiss not to focus on Florence to a special degree. The Republic of Florence dominated the region of Tuscany, and in 1434, Cosimo de' Medici took control of the city. And really, it's the Medici family that really are the godfathers of the Renaissance movement. They are the ones who really began to commission artists to create beautiful works of art, to focus on painting and architecture and sculpture. particularly Lorenzo de' Medici, his Cosimo's grandson, dominated the city when Florence was the cultural center of Italy, and all eyes turned to Florence for artistic and cultural lead. And so Florence was really one of the most important centers of trade and of art. Now, during this same time, we see the emergence of various Italian wars. We saw the growth of powerful monarchical states in the rest of Europe that eventually led to trouble for the Italian states, because these monarchical, powerful northern European states turned their gaze to Italy and saw these relatively small Italian states. Particularly, this will be true in France. The French King Charles VIII sought to conquer southern Italy, particularly through his major developments with the cannonball and the use of gunpowder. Now, he is in conflict with the Spanish king Charles I, whom really, at the end of the day, Charles VIII has a beef with the current pope. But the current pope is actually Spanish, the Borgia Pope. And the Spanish is backing the Spanish Pope. And so when you mix in the papal, monarchical kind of system and all of these kings, we see a tumultuous kind of condition. And ultimately, Charles VIII comes down to sack Rome in 1527. Now, the Pope is able to successfully kind of goad away the French invasion in terms of sacking and destroying and pillaging like you would normally see by redirecting the French king's eye toward another Italian state. But now we don't want to go into too much detail, because here we want to focus on broad themes through this lecture. Now, focusing on the politics, of course, but back to the kind of philosophical end, the abstract end, we really see a blossoming of political analysis in the works of Machiavelli. Machiavelli's The Prince is notorious and famous and very important, but he asks a very central question, and in this famous work, he comes up with questions that were very uncomfortable for the traditional Christian world that existed at the time. And his conclusions are really a sign or signal of this new human Renaissance way of thinking. So his central argument is, how can one acquire and keep political power? So you notice his premise is not, how do you govern well? Or how can you be a good king? Or how can you be a good ruler? But rather, how can you keep your power? A very human question. And essentially, through this book, he argues how rulers ought to behave based on human nature, not on Christian principles. Now, these, of course, are not the negation of Christian principles, but he says and makes the case that the ruler should be primarily concerned with the maintenance of the state and his power, rather than the upholding of Christian principles as the ultimate end. It's really the ultimate end is the state and the state itself. And so a prince acts on behalf of the state, not on behalf of his conscience, which we see an interesting bifurcation or splitting apart of the human kind of question, statecraft, and the soul, church. So we see the seeds that will emerge and bud in the Enlightenment and ultimately take root and blossom in our modern world with the concept of the division between church and state. And this really comes on the cusp of Machiavelli's writing. Now, during the Renaissance period, we see society making a significant and dramatic shift away from the traditional medieval society. In the Middle Ages, society was divided into really three estates, three groupings. a sort of trinity in terms of how things worked and functioned in society. Those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. And so the entire society is divided up into these kind of caste or class systems. But changes really developed toward the end of the medieval age, really pushed by the emergence of the Black Death and its impact on society and social structure. Now, first, speaking about the those who fight, or what we'll call the nobility or aristocracy. No, nobles were faced with declining incomes during the greater part of the 14th and 15th centuries. Yes, they had title. Yes, they were knights, but they didn't have coin. Which is interesting because many of the lower class people who had become merchants had coin but no title. And so we began to see the two intermarrying and intermingling. And so through that, we begin to see the destruction of that three caste system that existed in the medieval period. So by this time, the noble or the aristocrat was expected to fulfill certain ideals. Knights weren't expected to fulfill certain ideals. Knights were knights. They were brute men who fought and died and rode around horses and shot arrows and stabbed people. I mean, that was what you were supposed to be. But the knight during the Renaissance age began to become something so much more, where the knight was expected to be chivalrous, where he was expected to be the knight in shining armor, quote unquote. And that doesn't necessarily exist in the medieval period. And really this is characterized by one major book called the Book of the Courtier, which was written by the Italian Castiglione. And here is a depiction of Castiglione. Now, Castiglione is going to be focusing on the expectations and behavioral practices of the new nobility. And these are really characterized by grace, talent, character when no one is looking. That the knight should perform in military and physical exercises through various games, even perhaps like jousting, to win the maiden's hand. Many people see this in their consciousness and through popular storytelling as medieval, but it's not medieval at all. In fact, that is Renaissance. To gain a classical education, to enrich their life with arts, this became the new norm for the nobility. And the aim of the perfect noble was to serve his prince in an effective and honest way, a life of service, a life of honoring his king, honoring the people in a chivalrous manner. And this became the new norm. And so, again, just as a way of introducing this major shift in society, we see a shift from the medieval world to the new budding Renaissance world, not just in the arts, but in the expression and intellect behind it. And so our objectives were: 1, explain why between 1350 and 1550, Italian intellectuals believed they entered a new age of human achievement. And 2, characterize city-states, which were centers of political, economic, and social life in Renaissance Italy.